Sometimes the smallest dream costs more courage than the biggest one. The tattoo was supposed to be my reward. Not for graduating, not for getting promoted, not for achieving something extraordinary. It was my reward for surviving another year without giving up. That might sound dramatic, but when you spend most of your 20s counting dollars before buying groceries, small victories become important. My name is Emily Parker, and on the morning this story began, I had exactly $43.62 left in my checking account. Rent was due in 10 days. My car made a strange noise every time I turned left. My manager had cut everyone's hours again. And somehow I was still walking toward a tattoo studio with a smile on my face. The November air was cold enough to make my hands ache. Coffee shops overflowed with people carrying laptops and expensive coats. Downtown Chicago moved around me with its usual rush of ambition and urgency. I moved more slowly, mostly because I had spent 6 months saving for this tattoo and wanted to enjoy every second of finally getting it. It was not a large design, nothing dramatic, just a small compass on my wrist, a reminder that even when life felt chaotic, I could still choose my own direction. The idea had come to me during one particularly difficult night after my second job ended at midnight. I remember sitting alone in my apartment eating instant noodles and realizing nobody was coming to rescue me. It sounds depressing now, but at the time it was strangely empowering. If nobody was coming, then maybe I could save myself. The tattoo became a promise, a tiny symbol that I would keep moving forward no matter what happened. The bell above the tattoo studio door chimed as I stepped inside. Warm air immediately wrapped around me. The shop smelled faintly of coffee, disinfectant, and fresh ink. Framed artwork covered the walls. Music played quietly through speakers near the reception desk. Everything felt relaxed, comfortable, familiar. A woman at the front counter smiled. "Emily." I nodded. "That is me. Your artist is finishing another appointment. About 20 minutes. No problem." I took a seat in the waiting area and pulled out my phone. Across the room, a young couple looked through design books together. Someone laughed near the back of the shop. The atmosphere felt calm in a way that the rest of my life rarely did. For once, nobody needed anything from me. No customer complaints. No extra shifts. No overdue bills. Just 20 peaceful minutes before something meaningful became permanent. My phone buzzed. A notification from my bank appeared. I stared at the remaining balance and laughed softly. $43.62. It was objectively ridiculous to spend most of that on a tattoo. Yet for the first time in months I did not feel guilty. Sometimes survival deserved recognition too. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked around the room. That was when I noticed an empty chair beside me being occupied. A man sat down quietly, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing a dark wool coat. Probably early 30s, maybe mid-30s. Well-dressed but not flashy. The kind of person who looked completely comfortable wherever he happened to be. He nodded politely before opening a folder filled with documents. I barely paid attention at first. Why would I? He was just another customer waiting for an appointment. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline. Inside, the warmth of the studio settled around us. Everything felt ordinary. Completely ordinary. Looking back now, that might be the funniest part of the entire story. Because while I was sitting there thinking about a $40 tattoo and the uncertainty of next month's rent, destiny had quietly taken the chair right beside me. The strange thing about life is that the moments that change everything rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive with dramatic music or flashing lights. Sometimes they simply sit down beside you and open a folder. At first, I barely looked at the man next to me. Why would I? My attention was focused on my appointment and the growing excitement in my chest. After 6 months of saving, I was finally about to do something entirely for myself. The man beside me seemed equally occupied. He turned a few pages inside his folder and took a sip of coffee. Everything remained quiet for several minutes. Then my stomach betrayed me. A loud growl echoed through the waiting area. Heat immediately rushed into my face. Wonderful. I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole. The couple across the room smiled politely. I stared at the ceiling. The man beside me looked over. "Skipping breakfast?" he asked. His voice was calm, warm, surprisingly friendly. I laughed awkwardly. Something like that. That usually means yes. You caught me. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not enough to call it a smile. Just enough to suggest he found the situation amusing. That is a dangerous strategy. So is looking at my bank account before buying food. The joke escaped before I could stop it. For a second I regretted saying it. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed. A real laugh. Brief but genuine. Fair point. The conversation should have ended there. Most conversations between strangers do. Instead he closed the folder and set it aside. First tattoo. I looked at him. Is it that obvious? You keep checking your wrist. I glanced down and realized he was right. Apparently I had been staring at the empty space where the tattoo would go every few minutes. Okay, maybe it is obvious. What are you getting? Normally I would have hesitated. The tattoo meant something personal. Yet there was something strangely easy about talking to him. A compass. His expression became curious. Any particular reason? I looked at my wrist again. Because I spent most of my life waiting for someone else to tell me where to go. The answer surprised both of us. I had not planned on being that honest. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he nodded slowly. And now? Now I am trying to figure it out myself. The silence that followed felt thoughtful rather than awkward. Outside the front window, Chicago traffic rolled past beneath gray skies. Inside, the music continued playing softly through the speakers. The man studied me for a second. That sounds difficult. I laughed. You have no idea. Actually, I might. The answer caught me off guard. I glanced at his clothes. Expensive coat. Polished shoes. Nice watch. Everything about him suggested a life significantly easier than mine. He seemed to notice what I was thinking. Appearances can be misleading. That sounds mysterious. It is not meant to. This time I smiled. The receptionist called someone's name from the back of the studio. More customers entered through the front door. Yet somehow the small waiting area felt disconnected from the rest of the world. Like we existed inside our own quiet bubble. What about you? I asked. What are you getting? For the first time he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Nothing. Then why are you here? He glanced toward one of the artist stations near the back. A friend owns the place. So you are visiting? Something like that. His answer felt incomplete, but I let it go. Everyone had things they preferred not to explain. My phone buzzed with a work notification. Someone wanted me to cover another evening shift. I sighed. The man noticed. Bad news. Just reality. Reality tends to be persistent. I laughed again. It was becoming alarmingly easy around him. Then the receptionist looked up from her computer. Emily Parker? My heart jumped. Finally. The moment I had waited 6 months for. I stood and grabbed my bag. Before following the artist toward the back, I glanced at the stranger one last time. He nodded toward my wrist. Good luck with the compass. I smiled. Thanks. At the time, I thought I was walking away from a pleasant conversation with a stranger. I had no idea that before the day ended, I would learn exactly who had been sitting beside me all along. There is something strangely emotional about watching a dream become permanent. I sat in the artist's chair while soft music drifted through the studio and the first lines of ink appeared on my wrist. The sensation was not nearly as painful as people always claimed. Mostly it felt symbolic. Every careful movement of the needle transformed an idea into something real. For years I had postponed things, delayed things, waited for better timing, better finances, better circumstances. Yet sitting there that afternoon, I finally understood that life rarely became perfect before important decisions. Sometimes you simply had to begin. The artist studied the design and smiled. You picked a good one. I looked down at the outline of the compass slowly taking shape. I hope so. It means something. Everything. He nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Tattoo artists probably heard thousands of stories. Mine was not particularly unique. A young woman trying to build a life with limited money and unlimited determination. Hardly a groundbreaking narrative. Yet to me it felt enormous. 40 minutes later, the final details were complete. The artist cleaned the area and handed me a mirror. For several seconds I simply stared. The compass was small, elegant, exactly what I had imagined. Tears unexpectedly burned behind my eyes, not because of the tattoo itself, because it represented every difficult day that had brought me there. Every extra shift, every sacrifice, every moment I wanted to quit but did not. "You okay?" the artist asked. I laughed softly. "Yeah, better than okay." After paying, I carefully gathered my things and walked back toward the waiting area. The studio looked busier than before. More customers had arrived. Conversations filled the room. I glanced toward the chair where the stranger had been sitting. Empty. Of course. Why would he still be there? For reasons I could not explain, the realization disappointed me slightly. Not because I knew him. I did not. But our conversation had felt unexpectedly meaningful. Most people spent 5 minutes talking about weather or traffic. Somehow we had ended up discussing direction, choices, and life. Outside, the afternoon had grown colder. I pulled my jacket tighter and stepped onto the sidewalk. The city moved around me in its usual rush. Cars rolled through intersections. Pedestrians hurried toward offices and coffee shops. I looked down at my wrist again and smiled. Then someone called my name. "Emily." I turned. The stranger stood several feet away near the entrance. Coffee cup in hand. Dark coat. Calm expression. Somehow he looked exactly as I remembered despite only having known him for half an hour. "You are still here." The moment the words escaped, I realized how strange they sounded. A faint smile appeared. "Apparently." I laughed. "I thought you left." "I had a meeting nearby." He glanced toward my wrist. "How did it turn out?" I held up the compass. His eyes studied the design carefully. "It suits you." "You can tell that from a tattoo?" "No." His smile deepened slightly. "From the reason behind it." The answer surprised me. Most people would have complimented the artwork. He remembered the meaning. Before I could respond, a black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb beside us. The driver immediately stepped out and opened the rear door. My first thought was that someone important must be arriving. Then the driver looked directly at the stranger. "Mr. Bennett, your 3 o'clock meeting starts in 20 minutes. I blinked. Mr. Bennett. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. The stranger sighed almost imperceptibly. The driver continued speaking about investors, schedules, and conference calls. My brain struggled to catch up. Bennett. As in Bennett Holdings. As in Lucas Bennett. One of the most recognizable chief executive officers in the country. Slowly, I looked back at the man standing beside me. The expensive coat suddenly made sense. The confidence. The polished appearance. The mysterious folder. Everything. And the most unbelievable part was not that a billionaire had been sitting beside me all afternoon. It was that he had spoken to me like I was the most ordinary person in the world. For several seconds, I completely forgot how conversations worked. I simply stood on the sidewalk staring at Lucas Bennett while my brain desperately tried to connect the man I had been joking with to the name that regularly appeared in financial magazines. Felt impossible. Billionaires were supposed to exist behind television screens and corporate headquarters. They were not supposed to sit beside you in tattoo studios discussing life choices and skipped breakfasts. Lucas seemed to notice my expression immediately. "You look surprised." I laughed once. That might be the understatement of the year. The driver waited patiently beside the sedan. Traffic moved through the busy Chicago street. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed in the distance. Yet everything around me felt strangely muted. "You are Lucas Bennett." He nodded. "That is what the paperwork says." I stared at him. "You could have mentioned that." "Could I have?" His tone remained calm, almost amused. "Most people mention being one of the most famous business executives in the country." I was trying to have a normal conversation. The answer caught me off guard. Not because of what he said, because of how honestly he said it. Lucas glanced toward the waiting car and then back at me. "Besides, you never asked." I laughed despite myself. "Fair point." The driver quietly reminded him about the meeting schedule. Lucas nodded but did not immediately leave. Instead, he looked toward my wrist again. "Still happy with the compass?" The question felt absurdly ordinary considering the situation. Yet somehow that made it easier to answer. "Very happy." "Good." Another brief silence settled between us. The city moved around us while neither of us seemed in a hurry to end the conversation. Finally, Lucas reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a business card. Emily. I accepted it carefully. The card was simple. Elegant. Just his name and contact information. No dramatic title. No flashy design. Why are you giving me this? I asked. Lucas considered the question for a moment. Because interesting conversations are rare. My heart stumbled slightly. And this was an interesting conversation? Very. Before I could think of a response, he offered a small smile and stepped toward the waiting sedan. Enjoy the rest of your day. Then he climbed into the vehicle and disappeared into afternoon traffic. I stood there holding the business card long after the car vanished from sight. It felt surreal. Like something from a movie rather than real life. Eventually I shook my head and headed toward the train station. Reality returned quickly. My evening shift started in 2 hours. Billionaires might appear unexpectedly, but rent still needed to be paid. The restaurant was busy that night. Every table seemed occupied. Orders piled up. Customers asked for extra napkins, extra sauce, extra everything. By 10 o'clock, my feet hurt and my shoulders ached. Yet every time I reached into my apron pocket and felt the business card, a strange smile appeared. Not because I expected anything to happen. People like Lucas Bennett lived in a completely different universe than people like me. The card was simply a nice memory from an unusual afternoon. Around closing time, my friend Rachel noticed my mood. Okay, she said while stacking menus. What happened? Nothing. Emily. Seriously. Nothing happened. Rachel folded her arms. That smile says otherwise. I laughed. I met someone. Her eyes widened immediately. Someone. Not like that. Then exactly like that. I shook my head. Trust me. It is not what you think. I told her about the tattoo studio. The conversation. The unexpected revelation. By the time I finished, Rachel looked ready to fall out of her chair. You spent an hour talking to Lucas Bennett? Apparently. And he gave you his card? Apparently. Rachel stared at me for several seconds. Then she pointed a finger directly at my face. Emily Parker. What? You are absolutely going to call him. I laughed so hard that customers turned to look. The idea felt ridiculous. Completely impossible. Yet later that night, after I returned home and placed the business card on my kitchen table beside my fresh new tattoo, I found myself staring at it much longer than I probably should have. And for the first time all day, I started wondering whether fate had truly finished with me yet. The business card remained on my kitchen table for 3 days. 3 very long days. Every morning I saw it while making coffee. Every evening I saw it when I returned home from work. It sat there beside my new tattoo aftercare instructions like a challenge I refused to accept. Rachel, unfortunately, had no intention of letting me ignore it. You are overthinking this, she announced during lunch on the 3rd day. I am not overthinking. Emily. Okay. Maybe a little. Rachel pointed her fork at me. The man literally gave you his card. People hand out business cards all the time. Not billionaires who spend an hour talking about life with strangers in tattoo studios. I sighed and looked out the restaurant window. November sunlight reflected off downtown buildings while pedestrians hurried through the afternoon rush. The truth was that I had thought about calling him. More than once. Then reality always stepped in. Men like Lucas Bennett belonged on magazine covers. Women like me served coffee to people reading those magazines. Our worlds were not supposed to overlap. You are doing it again, Rachel said. Doing what? Inventing reasons why something cannot happen. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. A text message appeared from an unknown number. My heart immediately accelerated. Unknown numbers usually meant telemarketers or overdue bills. This one simply said, I hope the compass is healing well. For several seconds I stared at the screen. Rachel noticed instantly. What? She asked. I handed her the phone. Her eyes widened. No way. Apparently way. Emily. I know. That is him. I know. Rachel looked ready to climb onto the table from excitement. I meanwhile was struggling to remember how breathing worked. After several deep breaths, I finally typed a reply. It seems to be surviving better than my bank account. The response arrived less than a minute later. Good. I was more concerned about the tattoo. I laughed out loud. Several customers looked in my direction. Rachel covered her mouth dramatically. He is funny. Please stop. I cannot. The conversation continued throughout the afternoon. Nothing extraordinary. Just simple messages. Work. Coffee. Chicago weather. Yet every exchange felt surprisingly natural. By the end of my shift, I realized something alarming. Talking to Lucas was easy. Easier than it should have been. That evening, another message appeared. Are you free tomorrow afternoon? I stared at the words for nearly 5 minutes. Then I finally replied. Depends. Are billionaires usually this persistent? His answer arrived almost immediately. Only when the conversation is worth continuing. My heart betrayed me by smiling before my brain could object. The next afternoon, I found myself standing outside a small independent coffee shop near the river. Nothing luxurious. Nothing intimidating. Just a quiet neighborhood cafe filled with students and remote workers, which somehow made me even more nervous. Lucas was already there when I arrived. He sat near the window wearing a dark sweater instead of a business suit. For the first time, he looked less like a corporate executive and more like an ordinary man. The realization was unexpectedly dangerous, because ordinary people were easier to like. You came, he said as I approached. You sounded surprised. Hopeful. The answer warmed something inside me. Coffee arrived. Then another hour disappeared. We talked about everything. Childhood memories. Favorite books. Terrible jobs. Future plans. At one point I laughed so hard that coffee nearly spilled across the table. Lucas looked genuinely pleased every time it happened. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the river outside, I found myself forgetting who he was. Not Lucas Bennett the billionaire. Just Lucas. The man from the tattoo studio. The man who listened carefully and remembered small details. The man who somehow made me feel seen. Then while we were talking, a little girl passing the cafe window pointed toward him excitedly. Her father immediately recognized him too. Within seconds, several people were staring. Reality returned all at once. And for the first time, I was forced to remember that no matter how normal this felt, Lucas Bennett and I did not actually live in the same world. The moment those people recognized Lucas, something shifted inside me. Not because anyone was rude. Nobody interrupted us. Nobody asked for photographs. Yet the atmosphere changed all the same. A few curious glances. A few whispered conversations. A few second looks that reminded me exactly who was sitting across from me. Lucas noticed it too. Of course he did. He had probably experienced it thousands of times. The surprising part was how calmly he handled it. He simply continued our conversation as though nothing had happened. You were telling me about your second job, he said. The bookstore. I blinked. Right. For a second I had completely forgotten what we were discussing. Lucas smiled slightly. You seem distracted. Can you blame me? He glanced toward the window where the little girl and her father had disappeared. No, there was no arrogance in his voice. No annoyance. Just quiet acceptance. Like someone who had stopped fighting reality a long time ago. We finished our coffee and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. The Chicago River reflected silver beneath the cloudy sky. Boats moved slowly through the water while pedestrians crossed the nearby bridge. For several minutes we walked without speaking. It was comfortable. Surprisingly comfortable. Eventually Lucas stopped near the railing and looked out across the river. You are wondering what happens next. The directness caught me off guard. Maybe. And I laughed softly. And I am trying to understand why a billionaire keeps inviting me to coffee. Lucas turned toward me. The wind moved through his dark hair. Would you like an honest answer? Always. He considered his words carefully. Because most conversations in my life involve people wanting something. I frowned slightly. That sounds lonely. It can be. The honesty in his voice made my chest tighten. Lucas rested his arms against the railing and looked toward the skyline. When people meet Lucas Bennett, they usually meet the title first. The CEO. Exactly. He smiled without humor. You met the man sitting in a tattoo studio complaining about coffee. I laughed. That is true. You treated me normally. For some reason, those 4 words affected me more than they should have. Treated me normally. Such a simple thing. Yet hearing it made me realize how rare normal might actually be in his world. The conversation lingered in my thoughts throughout the following week. Lucas and I continued seeing each other. Sometimes for coffee. Sometimes for lunch. Sometimes simply for a walk through the city. The strange thing was that he never tried to impress me. No private jets. No extravagant gifts. No dramatic displays of wealth. Instead, he asked questions. He listened. He remembered details. One afternoon he showed up at the bookstore where I worked part-time and spent nearly an hour helping a customer find a history book. Another evening he sat in my favorite neighborhood diner and argued passionately about which pie flavor was superior. Watching him in ordinary situations felt strangely fascinating, because the more time we spent together, the less I saw the billionaire, and the more I saw Lucas. Then one Saturday evening everything changed. He invited me to a charity event hosted by his company. I almost declined. The idea sounded terrifying. Yet somehow I found myself standing inside one of the most elegant hotels in Chicago wearing the nicest dress I owned. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Business leaders filled the ballroom. Conversations about investments and acquisitions floated through the air. I had never felt more out of place in my life. Meanwhile, Lucas moved effortlessly through the room. People greeted him constantly. Executives. Politicians. Investors. Every person seemed to know his name. Every person seemed to want his attention. Standing there beside him, I finally saw the full scale of his world. And for the first time since meeting him, doubt began creeping into my heart. Because no matter how easy our conversations felt over coffee, no matter how much I enjoyed being around him, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Lucas Bennett belonged in rooms like this. I did not. The ballroom remained beautiful long after I stopped enjoying it. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across polished floors. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling drinks. Elegant conversations filled the room. Everything looked like a scene from a movie. Yet standing beside Lucas, I felt smaller with every passing minute. It was not his fault. That almost made it worse. He introduced me to everyone with genuine warmth. Executives, board members, community leaders, people who owned companies, people who appeared on television, people who probably spent more on a watch than I earned in several months. Every introduction followed the same pattern. A smile, a handshake, then a subtle look. The look that asked the question nobody said aloud. Who is she? By the end of the evening I was exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from feeling out of place for too long. Lucas noticed immediately. He always noticed. "You are quiet," he said as we stepped onto a balcony overlooking the city. Cool air greeted us. Chicago glowed beneath the night sky. Traffic flowed between skyscrapers like streams of light. For a moment, the distance from the ballroom felt like relief. "Just tired," I said. Lucas studied me carefully. "That is not the whole answer." I looked away. "You really notice everything, do you not? The important things." The sincerity in his voice almost made this harder, because the truth was not something I wanted to say aloud. Not to him. Not to myself. Yet the words came anyway. I do not belong there. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Lucas leaned against the railing. "Inside. In your world." The city lights reflected in the distance while neither of us spoke. Finally he shook his head. "Emily. Do not. Do not what? Tell me I am imagining it." I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. I spent the entire evening surrounded by people who have private drivers and vacation homes. Yesterday I was worried about my utility bill. Lucas looked at me for several seconds. "And?" I stared at him. "And those things are not the same." "No," he agreed. "They are not." The answer surprised me. I expected reassurance. Instead he offered honesty. "Our lives are different," Lucas continued. "That part is true." I nodded. "Exactly. But different does not mean less." The words landed harder than I expected, because deep down I knew my fear was not really about money. It was about worth. Somewhere along the way, I had started measuring myself against his world, against his success, against people who had advantages I never had, and every comparison left me feeling smaller. The following week only made things worse. Articles began appearing online. Photographs from the charity event circulated through social media. Most comments were harmless. Some were kind. Others were not. Curious strangers speculated about who I was, why Lucas spent time with me, whether I belonged beside him. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But words have a way of lingering, especially when they confirm fears you already carry. One evening I sat alone in my apartment staring at my phone while rain tapped against the windows. The familiar compass tattoo rested on my wrist. The symbol that once represented confidence now felt strangely distant. My phone buzzed. A message from Lucas. Dinner tomorrow? I stared at the screen, then at the tiny apartment around me, the second-hand furniture, the overdue bill on the counter, the stack of work schedules near the refrigerator. Suddenly everything felt painfully clear. Lucas deserved someone who belonged in his world. Someone comfortable in ballrooms and boardrooms. Someone who would never feel out of place standing beside him. And no matter how much I cared about him, I was not that person. For a long time, I looked at the message without answering. Then I finally typed the words I never wanted to send. Lucas, I think we need some space. My finger hovered above the screen. My heart felt heavy. But deep down I convinced myself this was the right thing to do, even if it hurt more than I was willing to admit. The message showed as delivered almost immediately. Then nothing happened. No reply. No questions. No attempt to change my mind. Just silence. Somehow that hurt even more. I placed my phone face down on the kitchen table and stared out the window. Rain continued falling across the city. Headlights reflected against wet pavement below. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the night. Everything looked exactly the same, yet something inside me felt completely different. The following morning, I expected to wake up feeling relieved. Instead, I felt empty. Work became easier because I no longer checked my phone every few minutes. It also became harder because every free moment reminded me of what was missing. Days passed. Then another week. Life returned to its familiar routine. Morning shifts. Bookstore hours, utility bills, grocery lists, ordinary life, the kind of life I had always known, the kind of life I once thought would be enough. One afternoon Rachel found me reorganizing shelves at the bookstore. You look terrible. I glanced up. Thank you. You know what I mean. Unfortunately, I did. I am fine. Rachel stared at me. That was the least convincing sentence I have heard all month. Returned a novel to the shelf. Some things are complicated. Did he do something wrong? The question came so quickly that I answered without thinking. No, Rachel immediately noticed. Interesting. I sighed. What? You did not hesitate. She folded her arms. Whatever happened, you are not angry at him. The observation lingered long after she left. Because it was true. I was not angry at Lucas. Not even a little. If anything, I was angry at myself. Angry that I had let fear make a decision my heart never wanted. Angry that I had spent so much time comparing my life to his that I forgot what mattered in the first place. Several days later, I finished a late shift and walked through downtown Chicago beneath a clear winter sky. Holiday lights decorated storefront windows. People carried shopping bags and steaming cups of coffee. The city felt alive. I stopped at a small park overlooking the river and sat on a bench. The cold air stung my cheeks. Instinctively, I looked down at my wrist. The compass. The same tattoo that had started everything. For months, I had treated it as a symbol of independence. A reminder to choose my own direction. Yet suddenly I realized something. Independence did not mean running away from every difficult feeling. It did not mean rejecting people before they could reject you. And it certainly did not mean making decisions based on fear. The realization hit me with surprising force. My entire reason for walking away had been insecurity, not reality. Lucas had never cared about my bank account. He had never cared about my apartment. He had never cared that I worked 2 jobs. Every concern had come from me, not him. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. Rachel. I answered immediately. Please tell me you are calling because you have finally come to your senses. She laughed. Actually, I am calling because your billionaire is on television. I blinked. What? Turn on channel 7. Curious, I hurried home and switched on the television. A business interview filled the screen. Lucas sat beneath bright studio lights discussing a new community scholarship program funded by his company. He looked calm, professional, composed. Exactly. As expected. Then the interviewer asked a simple question. What has influenced you most this year? For a moment Lucas smiled. Not the polished corporate smile people usually saw. A real one. Genuine. Warm. The same smile I first noticed in the tattoo studio. Someone reminded me that success means very little if you forget who you are, he answered. My heart stopped. The interview continued. Yet I barely heard another word. Because deep down I knew exactly who he was talking about. And at that moment, sitting alone in my apartment with the compass visible on my wrist, I finally understood something important. Walking away had not solved anything. It had only shown me how much I wanted to find my way back. The next morning felt different. Not because the city had changed. Not because my apartment suddenly became larger or my bills magically disappeared. Everything around me looked exactly the same. The difference was inside me. For the first time in weeks I knew what I wanted. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. I wanted Lucas. Not his money. Not his status. Not the world he lived in. Just him. The man who sat beside me in a tattoo studio and listened when nobody else paid attention. The man who remembered the meaning behind a tiny compass. The man who made ordinary moments feel important. Once I accepted that truth, the next step became obvious. It was also terrifying. Around noon, I found myself standing outside Bennett Holdings headquarters. The building stretched high into the winter sky, all glass and steel and confidence. Employees hurried through the revolving doors carrying laptops and coffee cups. I immediately felt underdressed. Then I looked down at my wrist. The compass stared back at me. A reminder. Choose your direction. So I walked inside. The receptionist greeted me politely. Can I help you? I took a deep breath. I am here to see Lucas Bennett. The sentence sounded ridiculous. The receptionist glanced at her screen. Do you have an appointment? No, she offered a sympathetic smile. I am sorry. Of course. What had I expected? That billionaire spent their afternoons waiting for surprise visitors? I almost turned around, almost convinced myself this had been a mistake. Then a familiar voice interrupted from behind me. Emily. I froze. Slowly I turned around. Lucas stood near the elevator bank holding a folder. For a moment neither of us moved. The busy lobby seemed to fade into the background. Employees continued walking. Phones continued ringing. Yet all I could see was him. Surprise flashed across his face. Then hope. Then something warmer. Hi, I said. Brilliant. Truly inspiring conversation skills. Lucas laughed softly. The sound immediately eased some of the tension in my chest. For several seconds, neither of us seemed entirely sure what came next. Finally, he stepped closer. What are you doing here? I looked down at the compass on my wrist before meeting his eyes again. Correcting a mistake. Understanding appeared instantly. Lucas had always been annoyingly good at understanding things. Emily. I shook my head. Let me finish before I lose my courage. The corner of his mouth lifted. Okay. I took a deep breath. I walked away because I was afraid. The words felt heavy. Honest. Necessary. I kept comparing myself to your world. Your success. Your life. I laughed quietly. And eventually I convinced myself I did not belong. Lucas listened without interrupting. The same way he always had. Then I realized something. I looked around the lobby. The building. The employees. The success surrounding him. You never cared about any of that. Silence followed. Then Lucas smiled. Not the polished smile from interviews. Not the professional smile from business events. The real one. No, he said softly. I did not. Relief flooded through me so suddenly I almost laughed. Weeks of doubt seemed to dissolve at once. Lucas glanced toward the compass tattoo. You know, he said. When I first saw that design, I thought it was about finding direction. It is. I think it is also about having the courage to follow it. The word settled somewhere deep inside me. Because he was right. The compass had never been about certainty. It had always been about courage. Courage to move forward even when the destination was unclear. Lucas extended his hand toward me. Simple. Uncomplicated. Genuine. I smiled and took it. Outside, winter sunlight reflected across the city. People rushed through busy streets. Cars moved between towering buildings. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet everything felt different. Months earlier, I had walked into a tattoo studio with $43.62 and a dream that fit on my wrist. I thought I was buying a piece of ink. Instead, I found something far more valuable. Not wealth. Not status. Not a perfect future. Just a person who saw me exactly as I was and stayed. And sometimes that is the one thing money can never buy.